International news to the eyes of the American viewer can easily come off as a mess of complicated and unrelated catastrophes. And if you see the international news this way, it's not your fault. The corporate-sponsored media in the United States is absolutely terrible at putting international news in a context that would explain the circumstances of how an event ended up happening, or even just doing justice to the people that event affects. And this is not a mistake or an oversight or something like that. No, this is by design. I want you to think really hard about what you've seen in the news recently about things happening outside the US. In fact, go back further than just recently and think about everything in your life that you've seen about things happening abroad. Things brought up during foreign policy sections at presidential debates, that kind of thing. And now I'm going to do a magic trick. I want you to pick a card. Think of the last foreign policy issue that you can remember seeing on the news. God, I'm so bad at shuffling. It's a lot of cards. Was this your card? Was this your card? Maybe this one? Or maybe this one? Okay, it's not a magic trick. I know these particular issues make up the vast majority of US foreign policy talk you've ever encountered in the US media because the US media has what I like to call the hot seat. The hot seat is where a country goes when their government is not subservient to US foreign policy interests, or even when there's just enough doubt about whether the US will get subservience out of a new government. There are multiple hot seats, I guess, or room for more than one country on the hot seat at a time, depending on how you prefer to build the mental image of this game show that I've created at this point. Personally, I kind of like the idea of them all squished onto one chair together. That seems wholesome. But the important thing is, when you're in the hot seat, you are made to answer for your every move by the US-aligned spheres of media. Anything that can be construed as malicious or a mistake will be, whether it actually was or not. Anybody critical of that government internally or who wants to leave that country is given a megaphone to voice all their grievances. But anybody supportive or even just nuanced in their take about that government are denied a platform completely. Some countries have been on the hot seat for what feels like eons. Russia's been there for about 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution. China's been there for about 70, Cuba for about 60, Iran for just over 40. And they're all there for one reason, and that reason is failing to fall in line with Anglo-Franco-American objectives. And I'm not saying that they've never done anything wrong. All I'm saying is that the only reason the US State Department and the CIA and the media find them to be objectionable is that American corporate interests do not have unchecked power there. And this is not really an opinion, it's a fact, and it can be supported with a quick glance at the gang of thieves, terrorists, despots that the US consorts with when the precondition of unchecked corporate power is met. We'll get to them one by one, but let's start with one simple fact to prove this case. 73% of the world's dictatorships are beneficiaries of US military aid. So if you live in a country where the social contract is nothing more than a gun pointed at your head, there's almost a 3 out of 4 chance that that gun was provided by the United States. And there's not a lot that those countries can do to end up in the hot seat. When's the last time someone tried to make you think about the political system in Egypt? Great question, me from 2 seconds ago, and I think I know the answer. In 2011, former Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak was overthrown in a popular uprising, one of the major events in what became known as the Arab Spring. Mubarak had been in power for 30 years and was a staunch US ally, receiving major arms deals and donations from the US and ruling with an iron fist, securing many key US economic and foreign policy objectives in the region, like open access of the Suez Canal, tolerant relations with Israel, and economic openness to Western corporations. So when Mubarak went down, you would expect the reaction from the US and its media to be panicked. But you would be wrong. Instead, the State Department was congratulatory to the protesters in their public statements, wishing them well on their path towards democracy. And the US media seemed euphoric, sending cameras to the streets of Tahrir Square and extolling the values of the revolution. This is a classic hot seat tactic. There's a spectrum of types of empire, and that's another thing that we're going to get into deeper in a later episode of this show, I promise. But for now, I'm just going to establish that I think the US is a particular type of empire that I like to call a crypto empire. Not like Bitcoin crypto. Crypto imperialism is a condition when a country lies about its foreign policy and its imperial agenda to its own citizens so thoroughly and for so long that eventually the people running the country are themselves deluded into the belief that they are not in charge of an empire. This only works because the economic realities of an empire are still so central to policy making that the obvious needs of the empire get met as overwhelming internal pressure is exerted on each elected government to ensure that those needs are met. In the case of Egypt, the US would do absolutely anything that it took to keep in power a government in Egypt that would not use the Suez Canal as a bargaining chip, get hostile with Israel, allow labor unrest, or anything else like that violates US interests. But critical long-term development of the economy of Egypt, like refurbishment and expansion of the Suez Canal, advancing of other infrastructure projects, education amongst the population, providing enough employment for people, all of this goes unmet, which results in things like, I don't know, a stuck cargo ship blocking the Suez Canal for days, or hundreds of thousands of unemployed, organized revolutionaries overthrowing your dictatorship. Coverage of Mubarak's downfall moved Egypt briefly into the hot seat. It started with the warm welcome, hey, congratulations on overthrowing that dictator that we were keeping in power for all those decades and all that. They then transitioned over into the second phase of the hot seat, the, hey, we're really concerned with the direction of your democracy phase. And this really peaked during the election that led to Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood becoming president. At this point, panic began to set in on account of the internal pressure. See, the Muslim Brotherhood is a conservative populist party, and the monarchist Saudi regime absolutely detests the Muslim Brotherhood. They share a border with Egypt along the Sinai Peninsula, and they were really not happy about having a government led by the Muslim Brotherhood as a neighbor. They were worried it would foment unrest and rebellion within their own borders. The media coverage against Morsi was sour to say the least, but more importantly, it became relentless. And to be clear, he was not a good president. He arrested critics like comedian Bassem Youssef, and was generally just not an effective administrator. But you know what he was? He was the person elected by the people of Egypt to lead their country in the only real election that they have ever had. And it should have been the Egyptian people who decided whether or not to keep him in charge in their next presidential election. But there was no second election. On July 3rd, 2013, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi led a military coup to oust and imprison Morsi, suspending the constitution created in 2012 and suspending Egyptian democracy. Al-Sisi was a CIA asset under the Mubarak dictatorship, and likely chose July 3rd knowing it would buy him days worth of diverted attention from the media in the US. And that's assuming he even picked that date himself, and that it wasn't suggested or demanded by CIA leadership at Langley. In this case, that's how you get off the hot seat. You know this meme? The sarcastic, oh no, that's terrible meme. That was the muted media reaction in the United States to al-Sisi's coup. This was over a decade ago at this point, and al-Sisi's regime has faced a negligible amount of attention in the US media. Less than 10 years than Morsi faced in the 1 year he was president, by far. Despite the fact that al-Sisi has tens of thousands of political dissidents held in overcrowded, unsanitary prisons, including foreign journalists. Al Jazeera has been campaigning for years for journalists they employ being held in Egyptian prisons on bogus sabotage charges to be released, to no avail. And Mohammed Morsi suspiciously died in one of those prisons. The United States gets what it needs from al-Sisi, and so his rule goes unquestioned in the US press and by the US State Department. And someday, he'll be unable to prop up the charade any longer, and just like Mubarak, he will be removed as well. And the US will do this whole dog and pony show again until it gets the strongman it demands of such an important colony as Egypt. We're seeing versions of this play out in West Africa right now, including in Gabon just this week. The US media has never questioned nearly 60 years of corrupt French subservient rule by the Bongo family in Gabon, but a military coup there earlier this week after the likely fraudulent re-election of Ali Bongo has put Gabon in the hot seat. Expect to see the US press hold the military regime to the fire until they can confirm that the new regime will end up subservient to French and American economic interests in Gabon. And then don't hold your breath, because it might be another 60 years before you hear about Gabon again. You'll hear about them next week if you watch this show, because we'll be talking more about French imperialism in Africa next week. And then you got your regimes that are basically impervious to the hot seat. And I can't think of a better example for that than Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government is one of the last absolute monarchies left on Earth. Their power is unchecked in any way by any other domestic institution. They are at the center of the power structure of OPEC and are one of the largest producers of oil in the world. And they can and have almost single-handedly caused dramatic shifts in the price per barrel of crude oil, the main driver of, among other things, the price of a gallon of gasoline. They hold a tremendous amount of sway in the Middle East, and their toleration of Israel is critical for keeping most of the region out of conflict with the Israelis. Because of this amount of power and influence, the US government and media give the Saudis almost complete amnesty for their constant spree of heinous crimes. Where to even start? Well, one place we can probably start is 9/11. The Saudis did 9/11. Bin Laden was a member of the Saudi royal family. Almost all the hijackers were Saudis. Al-Qaeda was receiving funding from other members of the Saudi monarchy while they were shacked up with the Taliban in Afghanistan, leading up to the attacks. Their fingerprints are all over 9/11, and they had one of the clearest motivations imaginable to draw the US military into the region to get them to overthrow the Saudis' arch-nemesis in Iran. More on that in a future episode. God, these future episodes are already packed, huh? Just the past week of stories about the Saudis is enough to make any person with a lick of human decency retch. They sentenced the man to death for criticizing the regime on Twitter. A regular occurrence in Saudi Arabia, the country that leads the world in murdering civilians for criticism of their government. And then last week, Human Rights Watch released a report that within the last year, thousands of refugees, mostly from Ethiopia and Somalia, were murdered en masse by Saudi border troops along their southern border with Yemen. Indiscriminate murder of men, women, and children repeatedly sanctioned by the Saudi regime. Crimes against humanity that should lead to Saudi leadership being imprisoned at the International Criminal Court. On Monday, the New York Times published a report claiming that sources inside the U.S. State Department and intelligence services have claimed that the U.S. found out about these atrocities in autumn of last year and received another report from the UN in December of 2022 about the atrocities. The U.S. government kept all of this secret until after the Human Rights Watch report went public. And the State Department doesn't even dispute that it was aware. It claims they told the Saudis to investigate themselves. Sure, Jan. That's what life is like for despotic terrorists like the Saudi monarchy who know that they're not going to be put on the hot seat. This was a story about the Russians shooting refugees from Azerbaijan on their southern border. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken would have his statement to the press ready within the hour. But when it's a U.S. ally like the Saudis, they get indefinite cover. If not for the Human Rights Watch report, the U.S. likely never would have reported these crimes to the public at all. And even in spite of the shame they should feel for propping up the most vile, fascist regime on this planet, the U.S. continues to cooperate with the Saudis militarily and gives them billions in military aid annually. Like a lot of Americans of multiple generations, as a young kid, I was under the impression that the U.S. was the defender of freedom and liberty in the world. Within that framing, the hot seat doesn't really feel out of place at all. Of course, that's what the good guys would talk about, who the bad guys are and what we can do to prevent them from spreading their badness any further. And then the US invaded Iraq. Iraq had also been on the hot seat for years prior to the invasion. Saddam Hussein was a caricature for evil and inhumanity in the US media for over a decade before the US invaded Iraq and deposed him. I was still just a kid at this point, and although I knew enough about war to know that it was generally a very bad thing to have happen, when the invasion began, the propaganda around the war was enough to convince me that the war would be worth it if it removed Saddam as a threat. And then a year or two into the occupation of Iraq, I saw this photo. That is Donald Rumsfeld, U.S. Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, serving as an envoy for the Reagan administration in 1983, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. This was during the early years of the Iran-Iraq War, and Rumsfeld was there to secure a large arms deal with Saddam, transferring him weapons which he would use indiscriminately to murder Iranian civilians as well as Iranian soldiers in one of the bloodiest wars in the second half of the 20th century. These weapons included mustard gas canisters, which were and are illegal under international law, and the possession of which was later used as evidence against Saddam in the run-up to the invasion in 2003. It turns out the Bush administration did know that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction after all, because it was members of the Bush administration who gave them to him. The 1979 Iranian Revolution and subsequent hostage crisis is often looked at through U.S. eyes as the starting point of modern U.S.-Iranian relations. As though Iran suddenly woke up one morning calling the U.S. the Great Satan and chanting death to America for no good reason. But between 1953 and 1979, the U.S. backed Iran's dictator known as the Shah, who ran a brutal secret police force who rounded up, tortured, and murdered at least tens of thousands of political dissenters and opponents during his tyrannical reign over the country. And if that's not bad enough, the U.S. and the U.K. actually put him in charge in a 1953 coup. The democratically elected president of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, had been working for several years at that point to nationalize Iran's vast oil wealth, most of which was under the control of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You might be familiar with them in their modern costume, BP. Once BP realized Mossadegh had the people on his side and wasn't going to stop until he had taken back all of the oil that BP had stolen under the British colonial government, they called their friends at MI6, which is British Secret Intelligence, who in turn called their friends at the CIA. A coup followed shortly after, sweeping Mossadegh from power, and even attempting later to try him at The Hague for violations of international law pertaining to his policies governing BP's oil in Iran. And then after nearly 30 years, this collapsed, leading to the Iranian Revolution, the US Embassy hostage crisis, and then the Iran-Iraq War, the US's revenge on Iran for rejecting its imperial rule. I'm gonna stop pulling all these strings for just a moment because I could really do this all day. I just needed to take you on the trip that I've been on most of my life at this point that leads me to be telling you these stories now. I had my heart broken as a kid, learning that this country that I thought truly believed in democracy and liberty was just using those things as a facade to facilitate violent extraction. And then I had my heart broken again when a man running for president on a message of hope and change led me to believe that he really wanted the United States to live those values too. And it was only as I watched those tanks rolling through Cairo to turn Egypt's brief, up, beautiful attempt at self-determination into ash did I realize that he was as much of a liar and a thief as his predecessor. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, you can't get fooled again. This program is going to be a news and current events program unlike any other English language program that I am aware of that exists, and if you know of one in English that I'm missing or that's produced in a different language with similar subject matter, my contact info is in the description. Please let me know. I'm going to put some links from some of my favorite sources for international news there as well. What we're going to do here is take a few international news stories per week. We're going to unpack some of the current circumstances surrounding those stories, and then we're going to put them in historical context, especially as it pertains to the actions of the US and its two primary accomplices, the United Kingdom and France. And by doing this, we're going to illuminate the reality of this Anglo-Franco-American imperial world order. The US is not the defender of freedom and liberty in the world, as I believed as a kid, and some of you might still believe right now. In fact, the US is the world's foremost violator of human rights, labor rights, animal rights, environmental protection, national sovereignty, self-determination, and international law. The United States is an empire. It's not like an empire. It doesn't just have some empire-like features. It is the largest empire of all time, and it utilizes widespread violence and terrorism to suppress the rights and freedoms of a majority of the world's population so that corporations, mostly US and European firms, can freely pillage natural resources and force local populations, including children, into working for them for grotesquely low wages, if wages at all, and in abhorrent working conditions. So now that we've got our introductions out of the way, next week we'll get down to business. Exploring some headlines, looking for those Anglo-Franco-American fingerprints and interests involved, and building up our understanding of how these modern forms of imperialism work. I've been Connor Buchanan. Thank y'all for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Mr. Vice President, welcome.
Good to be with you, Jim.
Has the time come for President Mubarak of Egypt to stand aside?
No, I think the time has come for President Mubarak to begin to move in the direction that to be more responsive to some of the needs of the people out there.
You know President Mubarak.
I know him
Have you talked
fairly
to him
well
about this?
I haven't talked to him in the last 3 days. I haven't talked to him in about a month, but I speak to him fairly regularly. And
the word to describe the leadership of Mubarak in Egypt and also in Tunisia before was dictator. Should Mubarak be seen as a dictator?
Look, Mubarak has been an ally of ours in a number of things that he's been very responsible on relative to geopolitical interest in the region, the Middle East peace efforts, the actions Egypt has taken relative to normalizing relationship with Israel.
This has been a presentation of New Ellijay Television. Visit us online at newellijay.tv from the library of the Ellijay Makerspace. Brought to you by New Ellijay TV, online at newellijay.tv.